The Axton Way, England's most prestigious road. 11 miles of cobblestones and conquest. Dawn, 71 BC. You'd expect soldiers, traders, the steady hum of an empire stirring awake. Instead, there were stakes, 6,000 of them. The air hit me first, the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood, dew unable to wash it away yet. Then, the sound, labored breaths multiplied by thousands. Ravens circled overhead, waiting for their grim feast. A merchant in a threadbare cloak adjusted his cap as he passed, eyes fixed firmly on the sky, not on the gruesome display. Nearby, a mother pulled her child back from the roadside, not out of horror, but convenience. The kids played near the base of a stake, as if it was an old oak tree. These weren't criminals or traitors. They were slaves. Men who dared to dream of freedom. Men who followed a gladiator named Spartacus and nearly shook the empire's foundations. This wasn't execution. Execution would have been mercy. No, this was theater. 6,000 souls dying slowly, deliberately, lined up along the empire's busiest road, so everyone could see, so no one could forget. Defy the empire, and we won't just kill you. We'll turn your death into a monument of our power. But here's what should haunt you. This wasn't even the empire's cruelest humiliation. Not close. What the empire did to individuals with precision, planning, and legal justification. That's where the real horror lived. The civilization that gave us law, order, roads, aqueducts, the very foundation of what we call civilization, also built the most sophisticated machinery of public degradation the ancient world had ever seen. And they documented it, proudly, like engineers proud of a new bridge. In this story, you'll meet 3 people the empire decided to destroy. Not their bodies, that would be too quick, but their humanity. And you'll discover why the empire believed this wasn't cruelty, but art. First, understand what the empire was. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. 30 million souls under its control. 3 continents. From Britannia to the edge of the Middle East. 400 amphitheaters built for public spectacles. One empire, maintained by surprisingly few soldiers. How do you control 30 million people without smartphones, without surveillance, without instant communication? The empire found an answer. Psychological warfare. And they perfected it. They didn't just build roads and aqueducts. They built a system, legal frameworks defining who could be humiliated, how and why. Economic incentives. Humiliation was profitable. Vendors, performers, sponsors, all profited from public degradation. 4 centuries of conditioning. Citizens taught to see this as entertainment, as civic duty, and they documented everything. Legal codes, personal letters, histories. Empire intellectuals debated this. Cicero argued that public humiliation created social bonds through shared witnessing. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, tutor to emperors, wrote treatises on why seeing degradation made citizens more obedient. They weren't ashamed. They were proud of this innovation. You're about to meet 3 souls trapped in the empire's machinery. Eleanor, a young mother who refused to deny her faith. Brennus, a warrior king who united tribes against the empire's legions. So Jonathan, the realm's most powerful man before one afternoon destroyed everything. 3 people, 3 different crimes in the empire's eyes. One shared fate. Systematic, public, calculated humiliation designed to break them so completely their destruction would echo for generations. What you're about to witness happened to real people, whose names survived 2,000 years. Their suffering was documented, not as tragedy, but as policy success. If this moment moves you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, hit like. It tells the algorithm that history's darkest truths matter more than easy entertainment. And if you think humanity is worth remembering, subscribe to Crimson Historians. We tell the stories that should never be forgotten. Stay with their stories. They deserve that much. The sun rose over the small town of Greenford, the cobblestone street glistening with morning dew. I remember that morning, the chill biting through my wool cloak, the distant calls of merchants setting up stalls, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the unmistakable stench of decay. I was walking along the Axton Way, England's most celebrated road, when I saw it. Stakes stretching into the horizon. 6,000 of them. Each one bore a man who had dreamed too loudly, dared too boldly. I swallowed hard. The blood was fresh, too fresh, and the shallow breaths filled the air like a ghostly chorus. Ravens wheeled overhead, their beady eyes fixed on the spectacle below. Passers-by moved as though blind to it all. A tradesman adjusted his cap and hurried on, while a mother yanked her daughter away from the roadside, not out of fear, but to keep the child from spoiling her shoes. Children played at the feet of the stakes as if nothing was wrong, laughter echoing against the silence of death. These men were slaves, led by a man named Spartacus, who had nearly brought the empire to its knees. This was no execution. This was a performance, a brutal reminder that resistance came with a price far higher than death. And yet, as I stood there, I realized this wasn't even the worst the empire could do. Something about that morning has never left me. The sight of Eleanor, a young mother just like any other, stuck in the machinery of an empire that saw her faith as betrayal. The strength of Brennus, a warrior king reduced to a spectacle of humiliation. And so Jonathan, whose power was stripped away in an instant, leaving behind only a broken man. Their stories, their lives, are etched into the scars of our history. And yet, the empire believed this was not cruelty but art. That's why I'm telling you this, because if we forget, if we allow their stories to fade, then we betray them all over again. And the empire, well, it may have fallen, but its shadow still lingers. Next time, you'll meet Eleanor, the mother who faced death with a strength that defied even the empire itself. But for now, take a breath, because the road ahead is darker than you think. The morning sun cast long shadows over the bustling port town of Whitby, where the salty breeze tangled with the scent of fresh timber and fish. I remember arriving there, my boots clicking on the uneven wooden planks of the docks, the chatter of sailors and merchants weaving through the air like a restless tide. But beneath the usual hum of life was a tension I couldn't shake, an invisible weight pressing down on the town. That's when I first saw Eleanor. She was standing outside a modest cottage near the harbor, her figure slender but resolute. Her dark hair was braided neatly, a few loose strands framing a face that seemed too young to carry the burden she bore. Her gown was simple, a deep green linen that brushed just above her ankles. Yet the way it clung to her shape hinted at a quiet dignity. Around her neck hung a delicate silver cross, catching the morning light like a secret beacon. Eleanor was a mother, nursing a newborn son, and yet she carried herself with a strength that defied everything around her. You see, in 203 CE, though in our story it's the year 203 AD here in England, being a Christian was no small crime. It wasn't the beliefs themselves that got you in trouble, it was the refusal to perform a simple ritual, burning incense to the emperor's image. A 5-second act of loyalty that could save your life, but cost your soul. Eleanor refused. The town's magistrates arrested her, along with several others who shared her faith. They tossed her into a damp cell beneath the town hall, where the air stood heavy with despair and the distant echoes of chains dragging against stone. For months they tried to break her. They promised her freedom, a return to her child, to her husband's warm embrace. If only she would perform the ritual. But Eleanor stood firm. Her diary, which somehow survived the years, tells of visits from her father, a wealthy man, once proud, now desperate. He kissed her hands with trembling lips, pleaded for mercy, begged her to spare her infant son. "Have pity on my gray hairs," he whispered. "Have pity on your child who cannot live without you." I've read those words over and over, and I can't help but wonder, how do you choose between your own flesh and blood and the faith that sets your soul on fire? Eleanor's answer was clear. She grieved for her father, but she would not deny her faith. The guards played cruel games. They brought her baby to the cell so she could nurse him, only to snatch him away again and again. "Choose the ritual," they said. "Hold your son forever." Each time she refused, the question stabbed deeper. What kind of mother are you? But Eleanor was no ordinary woman. She wasn't broken by their cruelty. Instead, she found strength in the unlikeliest places, her faith, her love, and a vision that would carry her beyond death. The night before her execution, she wrote one last entry in her diary. She described climbing a bronze ladder, lined with swords, reaching toward paradise. Then she wrote, "And I awoke, knowing I would not fight beasts in the arena, but something far worse, the very machinery of empire itself." The next day, Eleanor walked into the arena dressed in the robes of a pagan priestess, a cruel mockery forced upon her by those who sought to strip away her identity. The crowd, used to blood and death, shouted in protest. Even they knew some cruelties were too much. A wild cow was released, not a lion, too noble, too quick, but a cow, slow and deliberate, charging her, tossing her into the dirt. Bloodied and bruised, Eleanor rose and reached for her fellow prisoner, Felicity, a slave woman who shared her fate. They stood together, trembling but unbroken. Love, not fear, was their final act of defiance. When the cow failed to finish the job quickly, a young gladiator was sent in. His hands shook so badly that his first strike only wounded Eleanor. With her last ounce of strength, she guided his sword to her own throat, refusing to give Rome the satisfaction of controlling her death. She was 22 years old, a mother, a martyr, and as I stood in that arena, imagining her final moments, I realized something terrible. The empire hadn't just taken her life, it had tried to erase her humanity. But Eleanor's story survived. Her diary became a beacon for generations to come. Yet, hauntingly, the fate of her infant son remains a mystery. Did he survive? Did he grow up knowing his mother's sacrifice? Or did he curse the name Eleanor forever? History is silent, and sometimes that silence is the cruelest punishment of all. As I left Whitby that morning, the sun climbing higher, I felt the weight of Eleanor's choice settle in my chest. Faith, family, love, loss, woven together in a story that would echo through time. But the empire's machinery didn't stop with her. Next you'll meet Brennus, the warrior king who dared unite tribes against the empire itself. His story is one of brutality, strategy, and a humiliation so calculated it turned a hero into a ghost. But for now, remember Eleanor's courage, because the road ahead is darker and far more dangerous than you can imagine. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Northumbria as I rode toward the village of Dunham, a place where ancient forests whispered secrets and the wind carried the faint cry of distant horns. It was here I first heard the name Brennus, the warrior king who dared to unite scattered tribes against the Empire's relentless advance. Brennus was a man carved from the wild itself, standing well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of battle. He moved with a predator's grace. His hair was a tangled mane of dark curls, streaked with silver like lightning caught in a storm. His eyes, sharp and calculating, held the fire of 1,000 battles fought and won. He wore a cloak made from the pelts of wolves he had slain himself, draped over leather armor etched with tribal symbols. Heavy iron bracers encircled his muscular forearms, worn smooth by years of wielding a double-edged axe that gleamed with deadly intent. Around his neck hung a simple iron torque, a symbol of his leadership and the unity he forged among the tribes. Brennus was no mere warrior. He was a strategist, a master of guerrilla tactics that confounded even the Empire's most seasoned generals. For years he led disparate clans, once bitter rivals, into a formidable force that challenged the Empire's grip on Britannia. His name spread like wildfire, whispered in fear and admiration from village to fortress. But the Empire was patient. They understood that breaking a king was not simply a matter of sword and shield. It was a matter of spectacle. After years of brutal skirmishes and narrow escapes, Brennus found himself cornered in the fortress of Caerwyn, surrounded by the Empire's legions. The siege was relentless. Starvation gnawed at his people. Hope flickered like a dying candle. Then, in an act that stunned friend and foe alike, Brennus donned his finest armor, polished to a mirror shine, and rode alone through the enemy camp. His horse's hooves clattered against the stone as he circled the general's tribunal, a silent challenge burning in his gaze. Stripping off his armor, he sank to his knees before the governor, surrendering himself to save his people. Caesar's own words tell the story. The leader of the tribes rode proudly, adorned in all his glory, through the heart of our camp. Then, humbling himself, he yielded to our mercy. But mercy was a mirage. Brennus was thrown into the depths of the dungeons beneath the city, a pit of darkness and despair known as the Black Cell. For 6 long years he lived in solitude, the silence broken only by the distant drip of water and the echoes of his own thoughts. They starved him, broke him physically, but never could they break his spirit. Meanwhile, stories of the captive king spread throughout the empire, growing with every whisper. His legend became a weapon, a tool of psychological warfare designed to heighten the anticipation of his eventual humiliation. And when the day finally came, the triumph of Caesar, it was not enough to parade Brennus through the streets in chains. No, the empire had perfected a cruel choreography. The procession stretched for miles, a spectacle of wealth, conquest, and power. Captured treasure gleamed in the sun, banners fluttered, and the roar of thousands filled the air. And there at the center, limping but unbowed, was Brennus. His head was shaved, a mark of shame, his once majestic cloak replaced by tattered rags. Yet despite the years of darkness, the hunger, the torment, he walked with his back straight, eyes burning with defiance. The crowd jeered, spat, and mocked, but Brennus met their hatred with silent dignity. At key points along the route, the Senate, the marketplace, Caesar's own platform, the procession halted. There Caesar recounted the tale of Brennus's defeat, twisting it into a warning. "Defy Rome, and you will be broken." But Brennus heard more than the jeers. He heard the rewriting of his people's story, the erasure of their struggle, the betrayal of their hope. At the climax of the triumph, Brennus was led back to the black cell, not to freedom, but to death. Strangled slowly in the darkness while the city celebrated above, his end was a private horror, hidden beneath public joy. No monument, no grave, only silence. As I stood in the shadow of the ancient walls that once held him, I felt the weight of his sacrifice, the price of defiance in a world ruled by an empire that turned men into symbols and stories into propaganda. But Brennus's legend did not die. Centuries later, when foreign powers occupied these lands, his story was resurrected as a symbol of unity and resistance. Statues rose where once only shadows remained, and his name inspired generations to fight for freedom. Yet the man, the flesh and blood who rode into captivity to save his people, was forgotten in that long, dark cell. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. Tomorrow I will tell you about Sir Jonathan, the most powerful man in the realm whose empire crumbled in an afternoon, swallowed by betrayal and shattered dreams. But for now, remember Brennus, not just as a legend, but as a man who stood tall when the world sought to break him, because the empire's machinery of humiliation is far from finished. The city of Lancaster was cloaked in a heavy fog the afternoon I first heard of Sir Jonathan. The streets were slick with rain, and the air hung thick with the scent of burning wood and coal. It was a place of power and secrets, where the grand halls of government cast long shadows over narrow alleys. And it was here that the most powerful man in the realm met his downfall. Sir Jonathan was a striking figure, tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see through every lie and every truth alike. His dark hair was always perfectly combed back, not a strand out of place, and his tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, a subtle hint at the strength beneath the polished exterior. A gold signet ring adorned his right hand, flashing whenever he gestured, a silent symbol of authority that few dared to challenge. He was the chancellor, the king's right hand, the man who held the realm's fate in his palm. His word was law in the grand chambers, his decisions shaping the lives of millions. Yet, beneath the veneer of control, Sir Jonathan harbored secrets that would unravel everything. One rainy afternoon, as the council debated policies that would shape the kingdom's future, a whisper slipped through the marble halls, a betrayal so deep it struck like a dagger in the heart. Sir Jonathan's closest allies turned their backs, conspiracies unfolded, and suddenly, the man who once commanded armies found himself isolated, powerless. I met him days later in a dimly lit chamber beneath the castle, shadows dancing across the stone walls. His once pristine suit was rumpled, his eyes hollow but burning with a quiet fury. On his wrist, a simple leather strap replaced his usual cufflinks. His chains, invisible but no less binding. The empire that had built roads and laws, aqueducts and amphitheaters, had a darker side. It was a system that thrived not only on conquest, but on the calculated destruction of its own. Sir Jonathan's crime was ambition, not greed, not cruelty, but the dangerous desire to hold too much power. The empire could tolerate many things, but a man who threatened the delicate balance of control, that was a threat that had to be extinguished. His punishment was not swift execution, but something far more devastating: public humiliation designed to strip him of every shred of dignity. They paraded him through the city's streets, not in chains or rags, but dressed as a fool, clad in a motley coat stitched with bright, clashing colors, a cap with jingling bells atop his head, his polished shoes replaced by worn boots caked in mud, the gold ring on his finger removed and replaced with a crude iron band. Crowds gathered, some jeering, others whispering in disbelief. The man who once ruled the realm now stumbled under the weight of their scorn. At the city square, beneath the towering statue of the late king, Sir Jonathan was forced to confess his crimes, a scripted performance crafted by the Empire's finest minds to break him in the eyes of the people. But even in the depths of disgrace, there was a flicker of defiance in his gaze, a silent refusal to be wholly consumed. Behind the scenes, the Empire's machinery continued to grind. Legal decrees redefined his status, stripping him of titles, lands, and finally his name. He became a non-person, a ghost in the annals of history. Yet the most brutal blow came not from the crowd or the law, but from within. Friends vanished, alliances shattered, and trust turned to ash. Weeks later, in the cold solitude of a forgotten cell, Sir Jonathan penned his final words. They spoke not of regret, but of a warning that power wielded without mercy would always consume itself. As I left Lancaster, the rain had stopped, but the streets remained slick and treacherous. The story of Sir Jonathan was a stark reminder that in the Empire's grand design, no one was untouchable. Tomorrow, I will bring you back to the grim reality faced by 6,000 slaves on the Axton Way, their names lost, their stories buried beneath the Empire's relentless march. But for now, remember Sir Jonathan, a man who built an empire and watched it crumble, piece by piece, beneath the weight of its own cruelty. Because in this empire, power was a weapon, and public humiliation its most devastating blade. The Axton Way stretched out before me like a scar across the countryside, a brutal reminder of the Empire's reach and ruthlessness. 11 miles of cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, trade, and conquest. But that morning the road was lined not with travelers or soldiers, but with stakes, 6,000 of them, each bearing a man whose name was lost to history. I walked slowly between the rows, the chill morning air carrying the iron scent of fresh blood. The sun, barely risen, cast long shadows over the bodies, turning the scene into a grotesque tapestry of suffering and defiance. These were not criminals in the usual sense. No thieves or murderers. These were slaves, men and women who dared to dream of freedom, who followed the gladiator Spartacus in a rebellion that shook the very foundations of the empire. The empire's response was calculated, deliberate, and merciless. This was no quick execution. This was a performance of power. A warning etched in flesh and bone along the empire's busiest road. The stakes were placed so every traveler, every merchant, every citizen could witness the cost of rebellion. The message was clear. Defy us, and your death will be a monument to our dominance. Walking past the stakes, I noticed how some bodies still twitched, breaths shallow and ragged. Ravens circled overhead, their cries piercing the silence like grim heralds. Nearby, a woman pulled her child close, guiding him away from the roadside. Not out of horror. This was the Empire's cruelty at work, but out of everyday pragmatism. The child's shoes were new, and mud could wait. The smell, however, could not. I crouched beside one stake, where the body of a young man hung, his face frozen in a grimace of pain and defiance. His hands were bound, but his eyes, those haunted, burning eyes, still held a spark of the man he once was. The Empire didn't just want to kill these men. It wanted to erase them, to strip away their humanity. But in their eyes, in their posture, I saw something the Empire never anticipated. Dignity. As the morning wore on, merchants passed by, some averting their gaze, others speaking in hushed tones. Children played near the stakes, unaware or uncaring of the horror nearby. Life went on, as it always does, even in the shadow of death. I thought about Spartacus, the gladiator who ignited this rebellion, whose name became a symbol of resistance. He was gone, but his legacy lived on in these 6,000 souls. Their suffering was not in vain, because the Empire's machinery of humiliation was not perfect. It could break bodies, but it could never completely crush the human spirit. As I stood there, a sudden movement caught my eye, a hand twitching at the base of a stake. A prisoner, barely alive, struggling against the inevitable. And then I heard it, a faint broken whisper carried on the wind. Freedom. The word hung in the air, fragile yet fierce, a spark in the darkness. As I turned away from the Axton Way, the weight of those 6,000 souls pressed on me. Their names lost, their stories buried, but their courage etched into the very stones beneath my feet. Tomorrow we return to Eleanor's story, her final moments in the arena, where love and faith clashed with the Empire's cruelty, in a battle that still resonates today. But for now, remember the nameless, because sometimes the greatest stories are those written not in history books, but in the hearts of those who dare to resist. The amphitheater in Whitby was swollen with anticipation that day, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, sweat, and something darker, something electric. It was the Emperor's birthday, a day of celebration and bloodshed, where the crowd thirsted not just for victory, but for spectacle. Eleanor and Felicity were led into the arena, their feet bare against the rough stone, their bodies draped in the garb of priestesses from a pagan cult they had steadfastly rejected. The bright silks and heavy jewelry were a cruel mockery, designed to strip them of their identity and dignity. Eleanor's green linen gown was gone, replaced by a shimmering, gold-embroidered robe that glittered under the harsh sun. But it was a costume of humiliation, a costume that screamed betrayal. Felicity, small and fierce, wore a similar ensemble, her dark eyes blazing with defiance despite the humiliating disguise. The crowd, accustomed to gore and death, murmured uneasily. Even they sensed the cruelty in forcing these women to wear the symbols of the very gods they had renounced. Shouts rose, voices clamoring against the injustice. The Emperor's guards, unaccustomed to dissent, hesitated before stripping the women of the robes and sending them back into plain, coarse tunics. The arena gates groaned open, and instead of lions or leopards, beasts of strength and ferocity, a wild cow was released. A cow, not the swift death of a lion, but a slow, humiliating torment tailored for women. The cow charged with surprising force, knocking Eleanor into the dust. She hit the ground hard, pain radiating through her ribs, but she rose, blood staining her pale skin. Felicity lay crushed beneath the animal's hooves, her breath shallow, eyes wide with terror. Eleanor staggered to her side, lifting her friend despite the blood pooling around them. Together, they stood, two broken bodies defying the Empire's cruelty. The crowd's mood shifted. What had been eager anticipation turned to stunned silence, then murmurs of sympathy. Love, it seemed, could not be scripted or controlled. But the cow's charge was slow, too slow for the Empire's tastes. Guards dragged the women away to the side gate, where a young gladiator awaited. A boy, barely out of his teens, trembling with inexperience. His sword was meant to deliver swift justice, but his first strike only wounded Eleanor, slicing her ribs without ending her life. In a moment of fierce resolve, Eleanor took the blade from his shaking hand and guided it to her own throat. Even in death, she refused the Empire's final act of control. Her last breath was an act of defiance, a declaration that Rome could not own her, not even in death. At 22, a mother, a martyr, Eleanor's story would echo through centuries, her diary becoming a sacred text for generations to come. As I left the arena that day, the sun dipping low over the city, I thought about the paradox of her fate. A woman condemned for love and faith, who, in her final moments, showed a courage that even the Empire could not break. Tomorrow we return to Brennus, the warrior king, as he faces the most public and calculated humiliation the Empire could devise, the Triumph Parade, where power and cruelty collided in a spectacle of control. But for now, remember Eleanor, not just as a victim, but as a beacon of strength in the darkest of times. Because sometimes, the fiercest battles are fought not with swords, but with the heart. The streets of Lancaster thronged with people as the day of the triumph dawned, a day when the Empire flaunted its victories like a peacock strutting before an anxious crowd. The city pulsed with excitement, banners fluttering and merchants hawking their wares. But beneath the celebration lay a darker spectacle, the parade of Brennus, the once mighty warrior king, now reduced to a living trophy. I stood among the throng, the sun beating down as the procession wound its way through the city's heart. The air buzzed with anticipation, the crowd hungry for blood and spectacle. First came the spoils, gilded chests overflowing with treasures plundered from distant lands, shimmering fabrics from the east, and exotic animals from beyond the Empire's borders. Then floats depicting battles won, Caesar's triumphs immortalized in lavish displays. Finally, the prisoners. Brennus appeared last, his head shaved bare, the mark of a slave, and his once proud cloak replaced by tattered rags that fluttered weakly in the breeze. His bare feet scraped the cobblestones, but he walked with a dignity that defied his chains. Despite 6 years in the darkness of the black cell, despite starvation and torment, he stood tall, eyes blazing with the fire of a man who refused to be broken. As the procession halted at the Senate, the crowd surged forward, some sneering, others whispering in awe. At the Forum, merchants and artisans spat insults, mocking the fallen king. Yet Brennus met their hatred with silence, his gaze steady and unyielding. At Caesar's platform, the general himself spoke, his voice booming over the crowd. Here stands the man who dared to defy Rome, the leader of rebels who threatened our peace. He is a reminder. No one escapes the Empire's destiny. Brennus was forced to listen as his people's struggle was twisted into rebellion, their fight for freedom recast as treason. The final stop was the Temple of Jupiter, where the climax awaited. As the crowd feasted and celebrated above, Brennus was led down stone steps into the underground chamber of the Black Cell, the place where hope went to die. There, away from the eyes of the masses, he faced his end. Strangulation, slow and deliberate, a death designed to echo the Empire's control, even in darkness. No burial, no monument. His body was discarded like refuse, a warning to any who dared follow in his footsteps. But history refused to forget. Centuries later, when foreign powers occupied these lands, Brennus's story was resurrected as a symbol of unity and resistance. A statue now stands at Caerwyn, bearing the inscription, "A people united, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe." Yet, the man beneath the legend died alone, his dignity stripped away in darkness. As the crowd dispersed that day, I felt the weight of Brennus's sacrifice, not just as a fallen king, but as a symbol of defiance in the face of relentless oppression. Tomorrow, we return to Sir Jonathan, whose downfall was not on the battlefield but within the very halls of power. A tale of betrayal, public humiliation, and the crushing price of ambition. But for now, remember Brennus, the warrior who stood tall when the Empire sought to break him, and the legend that outlasted an empire's cruelty. Because sometimes, the greatest victories are not won in battle, but in memory. The grand halls of Lancaster's castle echoed with whispers the day Sir Jonathan's world unraveled. Once the Empire's most powerful man, his fall was not marked by swords or battles, but by whispered betrayals and the slow erosion of trust. The corridors, lined with tapestries depicting victories and kings, now seemed to close in on him like a trap. Sir Jonathan had always been a man of precision, a master strategist whose tailored suits and polished shoes matched the sharpness of his mind. His gold signet ring, once a symbol of unshakable authority, now felt like a heavy shackle as the Empire turned its machinery against him. His crime, ambition, the dangerous desire to hold too much power in a system that thrived on balance and control. The Empire tolerated many things, but a man who threatened its delicate order was a threat that had to be extinguished. Instead of swift execution, the Empire chose a punishment far crueler, public humiliation, designed to strip him of every shred of dignity. Paraded through the city streets in a motley coat, bright clashing colors mocking his former grandeur, and a cap jingling with bells, Sir Jonathan stumbled beneath the jeers of a crowd that once revered him. His polished shoes replaced by mud-caked boots, the gold ring swapped for a crude iron band. At the city square, beneath the towering statue of the late king, he was forced to confess scripted crimes, a performance engineered to break him in the eyes of the people. Yet, even in disgrace, a flicker of defiance burned in his blue eyes, a silent refusal to be wholly consumed. Behind the scenes, legal decrees stripped him of titles, lands, and finally his name. He became a ghost in the Empire's records, erased and forgotten. Friends vanished, alliances crumbled, and trust turned to ash. In a cold, forgotten cell, Sir Jonathan penned final words, not of regret but a warning, that power wielded without mercy would always consume itself. As rain pattered against the castle's stone walls, I felt the weight of his downfall. A man who built an empire only to watch it crumble beneath the weight of its own cruelty. Tomorrow we return to the Axton Way, where 6,000 nameless souls met a fate designed to erase them, yet their courage still echoes through the stones. But for now, remember Sir Jonathan, a man undone not by enemies abroad, but by the ruthless calculus of power within. Because in the Empire's grand design, no one was untouchable, and public humiliation was its sharpest blade. The sun hung low over the Axton Way, casting long shadows across the cobblestones slick with morning dew and the dark stains of blood. 11 miles of suffering stretched before me, a silent testament to the Empire's merciless grip. 6,000 stakes, 6,000 lives, 6,000 stories buried beneath cold wood and cruel iron. As I walked the length of the road, the air thick with the stench of death and decay, I couldn't help but notice the world carried on around this grim parade. Farmers moved their carts, merchants bargained loudly, and children played near the base of the stakes as if they were mere trees, their innocence untouched by the horrors that lined the way. These were not criminals. They were slaves, men and women who dared to dream of freedom, who followed Spartacus in a rebellion that nearly shattered the Empire's foundations. The Empire's response was calculated, chilling in its precision. This was not execution. It was a spectacle of terror, a slow, deliberate performance meant to break the spirit and warn all who might listen. I knelt beside one stake where a man's fingers twitched weakly, his breath shallow but defiant. His eyes, sunken but burning with a spark of humanity, met mine for a fleeting moment. A silent plea that echoed louder than any scream. Passers-by averted their eyes or crossed quickly, unwilling or unable to bear witness. Yet some stopped briefly, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of the faintest flicker of empathy. The Empire's machinery thrived on spectacle, on the shared witnessing of degradation. 4 centuries of conditioning had turned public humiliation into entertainment, a civic duty, a tool of control. But as I looked along that endless line of stakes, I saw beyond the cruelty. I saw resilience. I saw defiance etched into the very posture of the condemned. In the years since, historians have tried to erase these stories, reduce them to footnotes, warnings, forgotten names. But the truth refuses to die. Tomorrow, we conclude our journey with reflections on what these stories mean today, how the machinery of humiliation evolved, but never truly disappeared, and why remembering is our most powerful act of resistance. For now, remember the nameless, the 6,000 who faced death as a performance, who bore their suffering so the Empire's power might shine brighter. Because sometimes the greatest legacy is survival, not of the body, but of memory. And memory, after all, is the one thing the Empire could never fully control. The flickering glow of countless screens now lights our faces instead of amphitheaters, but the script remains eerily familiar. The Empire's machinery of public humiliation didn't die with the stones of the Axton Way or the dust of ancient arenas. It evolved, adapting to new stages and new audiences. Today, we don't chain rebels to stakes or parade defeated kings through cobbled streets. Instead, we live stream their falls, share their worst moments in endless loops, and turn humiliation into entertainment with a swipe or a click. Algorithms have replaced legions, and viral shaming wields a power as devastating as any sword. But the legacy of Eleanor, Brennus, Sir Jonathan, and the 6,000 nameless souls still haunts us, not as distant history, but as a mirror held up to our own age. Eleanor walked into the arena carrying the unbearable weight of love for her son and faith in her heart. Brennus surrendered himself to save his people, only to be broken and discarded in darkness. So Jonathan built empires, only to watch them crumble under the cold calculus of betrayal and spectacle. And the nameless slaves on the Axton Way, their silent courage echoes in every act of resistance against erasure. These stories remind us that systems of humiliation don't need monsters to run them, just ordinary people, conditioned to accept degradation as normal. History shows us that public shaming multiplies trauma far beyond physical pain, that forced performance deepens psychological wounds, and that collective witnessing enforces social control. But it also shows us something else. It shows us resilience, that despite centuries of cruelty designed to strip away humanity, a spark of dignity survived long enough to be remembered, to be written down, to be told again. And that memory is a battleground, because while empires can control bodies, rewrite stories, and erase names, they can never fully control what we choose to remember. So here's the question that lingers in the silence after the spectacle ends. What will we choose to remember? Will we let the machinery of humiliation run unchecked, masked in new technology and old prejudices? Or will we honor those who, against all odds, held on to their humanity? The empire fell over 15 centuries ago, but its shadow remains, in the corners of our screens, in the whispers of our societies, in the stories we tell and the ones we silence. If you've traveled this road with me, if you've met Eleanor, Brennus, Sir Jonathan, and the thousands who bore the empire's cruelty, then you've done what no empire could. You've given them back their humanity. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough, for now. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today, and the stories we refuse to forget. Thank you for listening.